documents, and with that comes a whole role of centralization. This is all before print, but much of what we see in an information age is there. And of course, one of the areas, and it goes back a long way, I mean, you have to talk about this in early records from the Middle East, is we start to get more and more business records and bureaucratic records. So that all the things that survive from early books tend to be exactly those books that in some way record these things, not the things that record people's dreams or their letters or their private correspondence, if there is any. Any idea why these are the things that survive? Someone other than Adam. Poor guy, he's been working so hard. Someone else give him a break. Why do these things tend to survive? Yes. Well, I think you're getting there. I mean, not necessarily more often, but when are they used? Yeah, they come up in disputes, yes. Well, one side is social control, and the other is in some ways control of your own life. That is, if there has been, I mean, when the bad fire spread through the Berkeley Hills in 1991, and at the time, someone had hit me, some ancient professor of paleontology had hit me on my bicycle, and I had a broken collarbone, so I was walking around in a sling, and the fire was raging across the hills, and the reports were coming towards my house. My wife was away. I had a tiny Carmann-Ghia, two-seat Carmann-Ghia Volkswagen, and I walked around the house trying to say, well, what do I put in this? What's the important thing to put in? And I looked at the letters that I had, from my mother. Where do I keep those? But then you say, well, or do you keep your financial records? Do you say, Mum, you go to the fire, I better keep my bank records because when the fires come through, I'm going to need to show that I rented this property, that I had insurance. So you hang on to them sort of for those reasons, and they're very crucial decisions in those times. So they tend to be better protected because they have all that kind of information about, my love for my mother is quite as important when I go to court and try to get my property back as the deeds that I have for my property. So we protect these things very deeply. And by the 12th century, we're now looking into Europe, and particularly England, we were coming into an age when more and more life had to be documented. So if we go back and remember that chart we had up about the spread of paper, does this fact tell us anything about why the spread of paper to Europe was perhaps slow? So on the one hand, we have this country becoming more and more literate and more writing, and yet oddly enough, it seems to be, because paper is all around, more and more resistant to paper. Is there a logical explanation to that? Yeah. You mean to forge them? Now, where forgery is one problem, that's right, it doesn't seem as permanent. So that's one. Another that we've already met. What did Trithemius say? Yes. The paper destroyed, it doesn't last. So if you're really going to say all our records depend on this, you're going to say, well, let's be suspicious about paper. And so in Sicily, for instance, after they began to use paper, the king insisted they destroy it all and copy it onto parchment because he didn't think government records would survive in that form. But what we start to get then are, we have to look at this paper not just simply as a bunch of scratchings, but as something that really comes from one person to another and represents their will and their intention. So we start to see, for instance, while people distrust the content of paper, the rise of the seal. Now, the seals had been very early in China, but by the Middle Ages, seals were spreading very much in Europe. And in fact, this is a nice chart of the growth of the use of sealing wax in England. And you needed more and more wax for your seals because documents were becoming more and more important. And this is something that takes us back to Socrates in a way. This, we don't accept the evidence of monks against bishops. Why should we accept that of a sheepskin? It's a nice quotation from an early medieval court trial in which someone tried to bring in a written document. And so you had this battle between monks and bishops. And the question was who to believe. And someone said, well, look, it's written down here. And the defense attorney said, well, look, that's just a piece of sheepskin. Why should we believe a piece of sheepskin? So one of the tricks becomes then is, well, how do you trust documents in order that they can play this role that we want them to in our growing bureaucratic litigious society? The ways in which property had changed hands in the past were often by giving signs that I approve of this transaction. So if somebody perhaps gave a piece of land to the church, they would also give their sword with it. And they say, handing over my sword, that's a sign that I am giving this land across. Or there's this case here with the Priory where the capture, he and his brother came in and they cut off a chunk of their hair. And they said, that's a sign that I'm willing to do it, to make this transfer. Keep that piece of hair, and that's a sign that you own the land. It's a sign of my will to do it. So what you start to get more and more is while you're getting people starting to write, you're simultaneously getting these physical symbols to go along. They're like when we talked about the various forms of inscription. These are the indexes that something I was present when that transfer was made, and to show that I'm going to give you this physical piece of something that I own. Whether they were rusty swords, knives, cups, staffs, chilographs, which we'll get to, seals, which you've mentioned, or signatures. And the signature still lies today to say I was present when that document was brought out, and the way in which you know I was present was that my own writing and my own signature is on it. So this relationship between what was written and particular actions becomes a tricky one to make. The chirograph, does anyone know what that is? A chirograph is when you write the same, usually what you do, you take a piece of paper and you write on one side of it, that I give this piece of property to so-and-so, so-and-so for this reason. And then you turn it upside down and you write exactly the same thing again on the other side, and then you tear it like that. So that if anyone wants to come back to court, they have to have two people who have to have the two sides, and they can show the document is real by showing that the tear down the middle perfectly matches up. So it's a way again that you show that this isn't just any piece of paper that someone has forged, this is the piece of paper that we referred to in the document. So there is a nice example of a chirograph. Looks like a suitably medieval document, which someone has drawn up very carefully, and then they've torn it across the middle. Anyone want to date that document? It's actually from the late 18th century, and it's a piece of New York, a piece of Manhattan that was changing hands. I think it's 1793. So these things hung around for a long while because people needed some way to show that documents could be relied upon. Another case was the Bury land grant. Does anybody recognize that map? You should all recognize it. You all know it so well. Just like clue, there's a bigger clue. It's more or less where San Francisco Airport is. It changed hands. It was a Spanish land grant from about early 19th century and belonged to a Spanish family, I think, called Sanchez. And a part of it was bought by this remarkable couple, Miller and Lux, who ended up, I think, having somewhere in the region of 3 million acres of California real estate, including most of the south of the city. They bought a small chunk just around the bottom of San Bruno Hill from the Sanchez family, and slowly and over time just began to move their southern fences further and further and further south. And the Sanchez began in the 1850s, and for about 20 years they would come to court and they would say, look, I have witnesses that this was my land. I don't have any documents, but I have witnesses. And the judges would listen, and then we go back for more trial, and still the fences would move south, until, I've forgotten his name, the ex-mayor of San Francisco heard the case in 1872, and he said, oh, of course, you've got nothing written down, and you just can't trust those Spaniards. So it's all yours, Miller and Lux, and they took over half the peninsula. So that notion, do we trust documents? Yeah, and if you don't have a document, will personal testimony do, starts to disappear, and you get into this odd world now where certain people who had long rights don't have any access to what they had a right to because they don't have a document, because they've been there from before the days of documents. Now that's something that happens in the Middle Ages, which I'm trying to show. It comes up to us into the last century. Land was still being problematically held because people said you don't have the right document. So documents are highly problematic. Now, one consequence of that, if we go not from San Francisco, but back to the Middle Ages, when people started to say, look, if you want to sell this piece of land, you have to show me you have a written title to it. And if you say, but I've lived in this land since the 4th century BC, how would I have a piece of paper? What's the next step, do you suspect? Well, the strange thing is, you start to get forgeries, which we mentioned before. Sorry, what's your name? Elizabeth mentioned forgeries. But the odd thing about these forgeries is they're true forgeries. That is, if I wanted to sell my land, I might well have owned that land but didn't have a document. I'd go off to a friendly monastery and I'd say to them, can you forge me a document that makes it look as if I own this land? Because I do own this land. And so, in fact, the basis on which we want to build our culture of written documents inevitably begins with a whole bunch of forgeries that are not forgeries that are frauds, but forgeries that are true. And the great centers of learning that we want to rely on, because they're the people who we trust, become the people who are the master forgers. The consequence of that is that we live in a strange world that is suddenly becoming more and more one of the topic of the class, manuscript culture. But these manuscripts now are highly problematic. Some of them are indicative that we owned or lived or did certain things or got a degree even. For heaven's sake, these pieces of paper are important. But on the other hand, some of them are forged but tell the truth, and some of them are forged but don't tell the truth. So the next step that grows up is what's called the science of diplomatics. And in the 17th century, this great man, the great Frenchman, this monk again, Jean Mabillon, who gets into the battles between two Christian religious orders, the Jesuits and the Benedictines. Now, he's a Benedictine, and this document comes forth, and they say, look, the Jesuits say, look, this shows that our claim is true. And Mabillon decides what we need is a science that can show us which documents really are true. And if you read the text, that's clearly not going to tell you. I mean, if I write a check to a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper looks at the check and looks a little dubiously at it, if I write on the top of it, this is true, or this is good, it doesn't really help the value of the check anymore. So what you start to look at are other things. Does it look like a bit of photocopied paper? And so Mabillon began the study of all these various documents in his book De Re Diplomatica, setting up in some ways the precedent of what are plagiarism checkers today. How can we tell whether this was written by the person who claims to write it? Now, some of it we look at the text, some of it we look beyond the text to the material object. A nice one where he looked on the front page of a document, there was an inscription, a drawing of the church, which was involved, and he was able to show that in fact the church hadn't looked like that at the period when the document was written, therefore it couldn't have been the one that was written. He looked at the sort of different kinds of writing at different scripts, but all the things that we now still need in some ways came out because people were depending more and more and more on the physical written inscription of these documents. So, Mabillon then writes a book in which he lays out these rules. And says, look, this is how you can tell a forgery from a good book. This is what you look for. This is how you tell if it really was written in the 16th century. What do you think the consequence of that is? So we've gone to this problem where documents are now spreading in society. So the next thing is everybody has to have documents. So the next thing is that we have a problem with forging documents. So the next thing is we have a science to tell whether a document is forged or not. So here we are. We have an advance in technology. We're getting better and better. What's the next thing? Yes, were you? Al? Good man. It becomes a guidebook for forgery. So poor old Mabillon, who is out there showing us, this is the problem, he does it so well that the people who really want to buy his book are the forgers, because it gives them a really good guide into... Now, one thing you're kind of seeing here is, again, an early version of what we see in things like spam wars, technological wars of one sort or another. We say, look, we get this technology that'll do this. So somebody comes along and apes the technology and does an imitation. So come along and says, I know how to detect an imitation. So the next round of spam and say, I know how to get past the spam filters. And here we see this all being reenacted in the world of manuscript culture. So there, in a way, what we've got through today is we've begun by looking at the eyewitnesses. We've seen the technologies develop, and technology is still with us. We'll talk more about that in print. This question of authority will come back again and again over this course as we look at different things. How do you trust? When we look at the beginning of science, when we look at questions about education, who is reliable here? And what are the unintended consequences? Now, one thing that we should remember, again, is we look back and we look at the notion of supersession and the famous phrase from Victor Hugo, this will kill that, ceci tuera cela. Well, now, clearly, that didn't happen with manuscript. We looked at that early prediction that, the typewriter would replace the pencil. All sorts of stories that, paper will disappear. And manuscript survived a long time after print. Look around you. How many people have a pen in their hand and a piece of paper in front of you? The technologies may come along and offer different properties, but they don't necessarily get replaced. It remained in accounting. So the most important records, as I say, when people tend to see their house burning down, or particularly their business burning down, the one thing they go for, the most important books are the accounting books. Now, they remained in manuscript probably up until about the 1970s. So typewriters were lousy for doing accounting books. They were lousy for music, too. I mean, the computer has come in and made these changes, but the print didn't. When we think of the print revolution, these are all things that didn't push aside. They were important, as we see from note-taking. That's still, even with computers, and many of you who are writing by hand probably do still have computers, but you decide for one reason or another that manuscript writing. Personal communication, again, sometimes it's an awful lot nicer to get that written note rather than a written one. And then subversive forms. There have been huge discussions of how Twitter brought about the Arab Spring. But nobody's really bothered to look at how the writing was on the wall, in very literal senses. And those who forgot to notice how few Egyptians had Twitter accounts last year. But millions of people walked past these walls and saw what was written. And not only was what was written on them significant in itself, but the fact that it hadn't been scratched out or painted over by the authorities was yet more significant. So the physical manifestation of this thing, where it was as much as what it said, was vitally important and remained to remind us that print doesn't necessarily simply come in and conquer. In fact, that's one of my favorite ones of how print and manuscript lie in a kind of dialectical relationship to one another still. And in the news this week, in fact, there was an interesting story about a Chinese school that is teaching Tibetan script. And that is just fraught with thousands of years of political antagonism of one sort or another, and the script is still stunningly and significantly important in trying to understand the politics. So as we look at these technologies changing and advancing, don't lose sight of how they still live on in their different forms. All right, talking of change then, we're going to go to, in quotation marks, the print revolution, Now, the question is, was print this revolutionary technology that came along as many have changed? We'll look at Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's usually held up as being a technological determinist. I think that's unfair to her. But she does sort of say, your print just brings everything on. And we need to consider that question. Is that a reasonable argument? We'll look, as I mentioned at the beginning, at a little bit of Adrian Johns from a longer discussion in the American Historical Review in December, but I just want you to look at one section. I've actually put the link up now, so there's a link there. And again, as I reminded you, Johns is also speaking on Thursday. So read that book, and if it's only 300 words or so, I think. If he interests you, look at his book, Piracy. It's a great book, and he'll be here on Thursday. All right, thanks very much. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I had forgotten. You thought you'll get away, but there's an assignment that comes with it. The assignment will be posted. It's asking you to look at, having talked about education, have a look at Eisenstein and what she says. There's only a little bit about the effects on education. Look back at what you've read in Tritemius and Plato. Choose one of those, either Tritemius or Plato, and compare them to Eisenstein's discussion. All right, sorry for forgetting that bit. And that's due in on Sunday. Thanks.